Hey, what is up you guys? Welcome back to another scary history video. With all these parts, I sure am learning more about our past than I ever did in school, and I hope you are too. From a few civil wars to some horrifying historical medical practices that are much better left in the past, to some really important events that truly paved the way for our lives now, and so much more. On today's top 10 list, we will be diving into 10 more true scary historical events that were not taught in school. Let's get right into it. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Did you know that it used to be common practice for people to just get a part of their brain cut out? Okay, well maybe not common, but it wasn't as uncommon as you would hope. Lobotomies used to be considered an excellent and efficient cure for things such as mental health problems, which thankfully is a practice that has not survived for a very good reason. Of course, in modern medicine they do still exist, but only when actually necessary, and there is of course a lot more knowledge about the dangers and effects. One well-known person to have undergone one of these procedures was Rosemary Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was experiencing seizures as well as mood swings, and while the seizures certainly were something that needed to be looked after for her health, I'm not sure if the mood swings necessarily needed some kind of medical intervention. Anyways, to cure her, they had a lobotomy performed on her. This procedure left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, and she could no longer speak or walk properly. After this, she spent most of the rest of her life hidden away, and it was thought that her family did this because they were ashamed of her, which is both horrible and so sad. In our number 9 spot today, we have the English Civil War. This might be something that is taught more often in English schools, but admittedly it's something I didn't even hear mentioned throughout my time in school. This was actually a series of civil wars that took place between 1642 and 1651, and while it is often referred to as one event, it can be divided into 3 separate wars. These wars were mostly in relation to the manner of England's governance as well as pertaining to religious freedoms. The first war was from 1642 to 1646, and the second was from 1648 to 1649. Both the first and second wars saw supporters of King Charles I battling against supporters of the Long Parliament. The third war took place from 1649 until 1651, and this one saw the supporters of King Charles II fighting against the supporters of the Rump Parliament. In the end, these wars saw the execution of King Charles I, the exile of his son King Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England. There's so much more information about what went on and who was fighting in these wars, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of it in the short amount of time we have, but it certainly was a revolutionary period for England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it really was concerned with how these 3 kingdoms should be governed. In our number 8 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. This one is a bit more well known than some of the others on this list today, but I want to specifically talk about one thing in reference to this that is much less well known. In 1807, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that this was obviously because of the wine-only diet, but that's not actually true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer. Truthfully, who knows, but I suppose in a very roundabout way he did still kind of die from this wine-only diet. In our number 7 spot today, we have the World War II dogs. A lot of us have learned quite a bit about World War II as it affected everyone at the time and was obviously a huge deal. We all have slightly different perspectives on it depending where you grew up and went to school, but it's something that is still widely talked about today. There is so much to cover on this topic, so of course some of it ends up getting left out of the history textbooks, but that doesn't mean the knowledge doesn't survive in some capacity. For today's list, I want to talk about a technique that was used in Russia during World War II that ended up completely backfiring. In Russia, they had trained dogs with bombs strapped onto their backs to run under tanks. I'd like to think that this technique also saw the dog being able to leave the bomb there so that they could escape, but that is most likely wishful thinking, but that isn't even what I wanted to talk about today. While this is, I suppose, a good tactic for fighting a war, there was one grave oversight during this training. All the dogs dogs were of course trained using Russian tanks, since that's where and who they were being trained by, so when it came time for the real deal, these dogs couldn't differentiate between a Russian tank or an enemy tank, which then saw the dogs running under what they knew, which were the Russian tanks. Certainly not the outcome that they were expecting. In our number 6 spot today we have Mary Shelley. We all know Mary Shelley as the author of Frankenstein, but there's one super creepy and kind of sad thing about her that is much less well known. Mary's husband was a man named Percy, and when he was 29 years old he was sailing with 2 other men, and on July 8th, 1822 they got caught up in a storm and ended up drowning. The bodies of the men were found 10 days later, and they were only able to be identified based on their clothing. This of course is extremely tragic and sad, and of course it would have been so awful for Mary to have to lose her husband at all, let alone in this way. Percy ended up being cremated, and for some reason his heart was the only part of his body that refused to burn, which I guess now physicians suggest was due to calcification from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. While this in itself is pretty freaky, at first Percy's friend Lee Hunter ended up keeping his heart, but later it was turned over to Mary. Instead of disposing of the heart or doing anything normal with it, Mary ended up keeping the heart, and she carried it with her for years. No one knew about this odd little keepsake until a year after her death, when it was found in the drawer of her desk, wrapped up in the pages of one of his last poems. What a simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful, but also ultra creepy story. The heart ended up being buried in the family vault with Percy and Mary's son after he passed away in 1889. In our number 5 spot today we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. You'd think at some point they'd realize that these remains truly were doing more harm than good. Well, I guess we did, but it did go on for much longer than it should have. The cannibalistic treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark, and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which led to a shortage of mummies. I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here at Most Amazing Top 10. I guess who am I to judge these past decisions, but all I can say is that I am very glad this is one we have moved on from. In our number 4 spot today we have the Chilean Civil War. Just to throw another war into the mix today, let's talk about the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The short of it on this war is that the president at the time, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, tried to give himself a lot more power than he probably should have had. The Congress weren't exactly thrilled about that, so they and the Chilean Navy rebelled against the president and the army. The Navy made the smart move by going north and seizing the nitrate mines, which were very economically important. From there they sailed south. Like any war, there of course was a lot that went on, but ultimately the Navy and Congress were successful and victorious. This war was actually the first war where modern torpedoes were used and were actually successful, although it took all of the torpedoes they had in just one attack. Part of the reason the Navy was so successful in this war because not only were they able to dominate on land, but also sea. This really led other countries to realize how vital it was for them to have modern ships and naval defenses. It also made other countries realize how important it was for them to have modern weapons. This war may be lesser known and less discussed, but it certainly was an eye-opener for a lot of other countries. In our number 3 spot today we have King Gojian of Yue. King Gojian of Yue had his reign from 496 BC until 465 BC. His reign took place during what was arguably the last major conflict of the spring and autumn period, and he was able to lead his state to victory, but it certainly wasn't an easy road or without some very creepy happenings. The major conflict he led his state through was the war between Wu and Yue, which started when a Yue princess, who was married to a prince of Wu, left her husband and fled back to Yue. I mean, this of course wasn't the only thing that caused the war, but it certainly sparked the fire. King Gojian was an extremely humble king, as he wouldn't relish in the riches he had as most royals would. Instead, he ate the same food as peasants and often would leave himself hungry in order to to remember that he was in a position to serve his state. Okay, so you might be sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to the scary historical event that you came to this video for, so here it is. As I mentioned before, he was able to lead his state to victory, but of course a war involves a lot of sacrifice and some pretty horrific happenings. King Gojian's army was very well known for their ability to scare their enemies before battle began, and this is because their frontline consisted of criminals who had been sentenced to death. In this time there wasn't lethal injection or the electric chair, so naturally it was a lot more of a vicious process. These criminals would decapitate themselves in front of the enemy army. Yep, I think this is probably the definition of a scary historical event. I can't even imagine witnessing something like that and then having to proceed with a battle against the army that has people doing that sort of thing. King Gojian was certainly not a leader who was wasting time messing around. In our number 2 spot today we have Topsy the Elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was born in Southeast Asia around 1875. She was secretly brought into the United States shortly after and was unfortunately added to a circus who advertised her as the first elephant born in the US, despite that obviously not being true. During her 25 years with the circus, she gained a reputation as a bad elephant, and after she ended up killing a guest at the circus, she was sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park in 1902. The Sea Lion Park was eventually sold and renamed to Luna Park, and during Topsy's time here, she was involved in quite a few highly publicized incidents, which could be attributed to her drunken handler, the publicity-hungry owners of the circus, as well as the fact that this is all a perfect example of why animals that belong in the wild should be in the wild. In the end, all of the horrible people who had a hand in Topsy being in this circus decided that since she was such a problem, they would execute her publicly. They were going to hang her, but because people thought that that was inhumane, they decided to take a different route. For the record, I just want to say that the execution of Topsy was inhumane no matter what method they chose, because Topsy didn't deserve to be in this kind of an environment. On January 4th of 1903, Topsy was fed carrots that were laced with potassium cyanide, and she was also electrocuted and strangled. To make this horrific day even worse, the event was both spectated and the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company was there to film the whole thing. Many people believe Thomas Edison was actually there himself, but that is something that is up for debate. This whole situation is absolutely heartbreaking, and Topsy deserved a lot better than everything she had to go through. In our number 1 spot today we have the Red Summer. The Red Summer is something I didn't even hear mentioned in school, which is honestly absolutely shocking. I'm hoping this is something that is more commonly taught than I think it is, because it certainly is very important. The Red Summer is the term used to refer to the period from the late winter through to the early autumn of 1919, in which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 36 cities across America. Some of the more well-known race riots that took place during the Red Summer were the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots, and the Red Summer also saw the Elaine massacre that took place in Elaine, Arkansas, which saw the deaths of between 100 to 240 black Americans. These anti-black riots are said to have developed from a multitude of post-World War I tensions, such as the economic slump and the competition in job and housing markets. In 1919, it certainly wasn't uncommon for there to be race riots and a multitude of white on black violence, but the Red Summer really marked some of the first race riots in which black people in number stood up to the white supremacy, resisted, and fought back. During the Red Summer, a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph publicly defended the right of black people to self-defense. It is said that between January 1st and September 14th of 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 black Americans, but despite this, the states refused to interfere or prosecute these mobs. Considering how many race riots went on during this summer, we truly could dedicate an entire video to the Red Summer. It is insane to think about how recent 1919 really was, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done, and part of the work involves us learning about these horrible histories and what happened in our past. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski. Let me know down below in the comments if you knew about any of these historical events, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Is that how you say that? I don't know, whatever. Lobotomies? In our number 10 In our number 10 spot today, we have lobotomies.